In progress. Okay.
Sorry, just turn on focus mode. I got an email from Peter, but I'm not sure where he is.
I'm just going to apologize up front. If I go on to just audio, it's only just because I've been getting visual migraines all day, so sometimes I can't see anything, so it's easy to just listen.
Yeah, that's fair enough. Don't think that's an issue.
It's one of those things.
Yeah, we have to decide on some areas of focus. Mark, did you write the little bio thing? Mark, are you frozen? Yeah, I think Mark's frozen. How are you, Bob?
Oh, I'm pretty good. Given that it's the third year of you know what, and
Yeah.
but how's everybody else? I hope you're all doing fine.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, Mark, did you do the bio thing?
I just seen your email. I will. The bit that I'm confused. I know this. That it's all what you're used to, but the thing I'm still trying to wrap my head around is what things are called, because the WordPress basically is personal blogging software. So you have the folksonomy problem that once we're going to use it for multiple people, we need to have we need to avoid the thing where everyone just labels things whatever they need, and it becomes a pot mess, or else what it ends up is a janitorial task of it's a bit like looking after a wiki. There's always some poor benighted person who's constantly sweeping the aisles and turning.
Mark, it's just a matter of people having a bio up. It's not.
Yeah, but where do you go? I mean, the point is, the bit that's not
you just write it. If you go to the site now and look on a recent post, Bint put one up, I put one up. It's just literally who we, kind of who we are for our glossary use.
No, that's not that. Sorry, we're across purposes. The bit I don't get, because I'm not used to using blogging software, is so you just give it any random name for.
You give it your name.
Right. So you name the article what you want the title of it to be.
Yeah, if you go to the site now and click on recent post, you can see.
No, I looked at it. The reason I'm asking is that it doesn't make any sense to me, because I'm not used to using blogging software. I've been writing HTML since the early 90s. I know how to write an HTML page. I'm less clear about the way basically the design intent of the blogging software, which basically seems to be like a laundry heap where you throw stuff on and whatever's on the top.
I'm not asking you to do some kind of an in-depth blogging protocol here. I'm just asking if you can write a paragraph bio and put it on a post.
Yes, yeah, and all I'm asking is the bit that is sliding between us is the process. So you come with an intent. So basically, presumably you choose a name before you start for the page, because the page becomes the URL and the permalink to it. And if this is the journal, so it's not just us random. It's not the content. The content is clear about. I'm talking about us having some discipline into the naming of things, so that because the other weakness of a blog is it's very dependent on folksonomic keywording, which is fine if it's one person, but I've noticed in any blog I follow, what actually happens is it goes through a meltdown about every 6 months with the keywords all spiraled out of control. Can't find anything.
That's for tagging and all of that stuff. Nobody has done it. We've had the site for a month. Right. So I'm also trying to understand why nobody has done it.
Well, I was explaining because when I look at the UI, I don't know where to do stuff. That's all I'm explaining. So
Okay.
I know
Mark,
it seems obvious
I-
to you. It's not obvious to everybody. That's all.
Mark, I sent the login is, is
I've got that. No, right. You
and then you have to
I'm-
just, no, Mark, I'm trying to
think
tell
in
you.
visual terms. What I'm saying is what's obvious to you is clearly not obvious to me. It's as simple as that. I can't put a simple thing. I see that page and I don't really know what I'm supposed to be doing. I know what I'll add, but I'm not used to using a word processor.
I'm trying to tell you that. You literally just write, as though it's Notepad or something, your bio, or paste it in. With the subject is your name, then you write your bio in the body, and then you post. If you want to, you can assign it the category team, but beyond that, we haven't set anything up for links or categories or tags or anything like that. So that's it. It's really probably a lot simpler than you expect.
Yeah, that's what's confusing me. I can write. I mean, I can write an HTML page, and that makes perfect sense to me. And indeed, I'd much rather write in plain text than in a WYSIWYG thing, because I just find all that confusing, because it's just lots of visual noise. But okay, well, I'll take a look. So the issue isn't actually having some content. The issue is understanding the UI.
No,
Which to me is very
understand
counterintuitive.
Peter, can you also put up a bio on the site, please?
Will do.
Thanks.
Oh,
Hey,
I just
Bob.
shot out an
Yeah.
email agreeing with you on your branding thoughts. And also I included a link in the email on a new piece that Maggie Appleton just dropped, calling for an open block protocol for the web. And looks like something that we might want to get involved in. Let me find that link and I'll paste it into the chat here.
I've got it open. I can do that for you.
Oh, great.
I was just looking at it. There we go.
Yep, that's it. Thanks. Because it occurred to me that they might be able to update their protocol a little bit to automatically generate visual meta for the individual blocks. So that'd be a real nice way for us to interact with that group.
Or even just use what they have. If you look at the post number 7, property values in JSON, that's exactly the same as what we use in Visual Meta, I think, for the scheme of a flight.
Yeah. And the useful thing is nothing else, just drawing the links to the fact that there's no lack of alignment between effectively Visual Meta and some of these other things, because that all helps pull the skein together. Because in a sense, as what Visual Meta should grow to encompass is in a sense a sort of skeleton of which to hang all sorts of other bits of metadata. I mean, that's what I'm seeing it coming to mean. We started in the sort of digital print domain, but as I think we discussed, was it probably in the last meetup, how as you step, for instance, from one environment, from a sort of 2D digital environment to a 3D one, you're going to want to pull along also or have all sorts of attendant metadata, which may not be in the visual meta itself, but needs to be dereferenced as a part of the way of objects understanding, where they are in the world.
That seemed like a really nice and relevant development for us to take a look at.
Yeah, it looks interesting. Just having a look here.
I think technically we're really well positioned.
Yeah. So Bob, how are you? I see you have gone a little bit in the background in the early minutes here when we're starting. Wondering who's here today other than Mark and Peter.
I click off my video when I'm uninterested in the topic.
That's fair enough.
And I don't know if I can create a trend in that direction or not, but I'm just not interested in technical people talking technical stuff that I don't understand a bit of, but I rely on a great deal and appreciate all your work. But I just, if I'm coming to the future of text, I'm more interested in the future of text, and even the slightly larger topic of the future of thought improvement. So that's where I come from these days. That's what I'm working on with a couple of universities, University of Melbourne and the University of North Carolina State. And we're trying to understand how intelligence and analysts might be using narrative and not have much of a methodology for understanding or evaluating how they deal with narrative.
Bob, is that Beth Cardio and Howard?
No, at Melbourne, the place that I've been dealing with is the Hunt Lab.
Right.
There, it's called the Hunt Lab for Intelligence Analysis. I worked with them for the last since about 2017 as a contractor, although the director and I have been very close colleagues, and I've helped him out as a volunteer for many years before that, maybe 20 years before that. His name is Tim Van Gelder. And the North Carolina State group is a young woman psychologist named Christine Brew, B-R-U-G-H. Anyway, it's a funded project, and we're working away on it.
Yeah, because it sounds linked to someone I met through the Tinderbox community called Ted Goranson.
Ted what?
Ted Goranson.
Goranson.
Who basically was working well doing similar funded stuff for lettered agencies, and he's now in Australia. And he's now, in fact, married to someone called Beth Cardio, and they were doing all sorts of narrative deconstruction of video, all to the same end, which is basically trying to work out if you can parse out a narrative from a video to understand what's going on in it. I found it all a bit brain-meltingly complex, but really interesting.
Could you send me a link to them?
Yeah, we'll do. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
I'll probably have to do it after this because I need to.
That's all right. No rush. But the attempt to parse narrative would be very relevant to what we're doing. Particularly, we're just getting started. So we've declared that there isn't a theory, that there isn't a way of evaluating it, and there isn't a methodology. So any help would help.
Yeah, I mean, I think the lineage of it was an attempt to move on from the generation of things where people were doing very fast analysis of spoken word. And someone said, well, people aren't just speaking anymore, they're sending other stuff. We need to figure it out.
What we've done, at least one experiment, and last few years ago, and then what we're planning to do is to have teams of analysts work on specific intelligence problems, geopolitical problems, or terrorist problems, or something like that, and have them communicate in a chat-like space, such that we can see all of their communication. And then we can make either identify specific moves that they make in the way of creating a narrative or evaluating a narrative, or infer those kind of moves, which they, where there's only just a little bit of evidence, like a, huh? Or what are you saying about, that sort of thing. That's what we're doing.
Yeah, I put a couple of names in the chat, and I can probably find at least one slight tangential paper. Ted put up on this. You know, it was only a short paper on this it was at Hypertext 2017.
Yeah.
Anyway, I
Any
see
sort of-
Peter. Sorry.
I'll
go ahead.
follow up with him. I mean, with an email or something, if I can find it. Mhm.
Yeah. I see Peter's got his hand up.
Yes, you might also want to look at some of the work Roger Schenck did at his Institute of Learning Sciences at Northwestern before its funding from Arthur Anderson got pulled when Anderson got trashed by those rogue prosecutors. He was looking at large bodies of video and looking for thematic structures in them, chopping them up and reorganizing them and building ask systems to be able to relate them, pull examples together. The other thing to look for is a Google search on Engines for Education, which was a hypertext book that summarized that work. It originally came out as a Mac 2CX era CD-ROM product that can no longer be run on any current Mac. So the disk itself is utterly useless, but the text of the book is available. And they also have links to a number of the static videos that you can still watch.
Wonderful. And do you have the link to that site?
I'll dig it up.
I wrote down Engines for Education to make sure that I follow up on that. I do have one of Schenck's books, but it's a little early on and I didn't find it extremely useful. I think it was when he was just getting started.
Yeah, this work is much more applied. Hang on, posting the link for the book website there. He also did a more recent book on future decision making. Let me duck into my library. I'll be back with the title in a minute.
Okay.
I shall return very shortly.
Thank you. Thank you for asking what I'm doing, Frode.
Yeah, it's good. We haven't seen you in a while, so that's
Yes.
good. Yeah, Brandel, I saw you have been talking to Maggie, so that's kind of interesting. But also, I think, and sorry, Bob, that you're relatively new here, to just bring up the thing of, I think everybody in the group who wants to it would be really good if we can put bios up on our blog.
Mm-hmm.
Because then we can kind of use that also in the newsletter and so on, if that's cool.
Right.
Brandel, can you, are you okay putting up a bio?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, right, Bob too, good. And then I was supposed to send out a kind of an article piece today, but it just got messier and messier. And then I had to ask more and more fundamental questions. And within the AR world, reading up a lot on what Apple's doing, there's a ton of public stuff, of course, what companies they've bought and patents and all of that stuff. And looking at all these huge companies doing huge things, I think we really need to narrow it down and try to focus on what we can actually do that's useful. I think a lot of the stuff that Apple's doing of the actual person in that space. Hi, Brandon, again.
Hello.
I'm just talking about narrowing. We should decide on narrowing down to what to do, because there's a little bit of that joke of, drunk guy walking down the street by a lamp. Police officer says, "What are you doing?" "I'm looking for my keys." "Oh, did you lose them here?" "No, but it's too dark where I lost them." Right. We have to make sure we don't just do the fun stuff. We also have to look at where we can actually make any kind of a useful contribution,
Yes.
Agreed.
And one of the issues there maybe is what is actually unique about VR AR? I mean, that obvious question in the sense that the early computers, like the first Apple, it seems to be spreadsheets that got that off the ground. That was a uniquely new thing that couldn't happen before. And then with the Mac, it was desktop publishing, of course. What is the uniquely thing that'll happen for AR, VR? Of course, some of it will be social and gaming, no question. But within work, what is the equivalent?
Sorry for the delay. It was on one of the real high shelves. I have the ISBN keyed in now.
Oh, you're sorry, Peter, you were away. I didn't realize. Yeah,
I was in the library.
Just finishing
down the title.
Right. Just finishing something brief. So one of the kind of interesting and slightly worrying things is how rapidly the Oculus is being updated. Worrying in the sense that the good thing is hand gestures now are available to developers more. the APIs seem to have open, but also structures for how to interact are being more formally coded, so you have the same interactions across different environments. And of course, that's good for the user, but it's bad for us in the sense that it narrows down our opportunity for trying to figure out something new. So the conclusion of the thing that I wrote, and I'll send it later, you can skim it if you want, but it is, if we had all the resources in the world, in our sense, we should probably try to make an actual lab in the sense of building an environment where we can change the variables frequently. You know, what interactions mean and how things appear and all that good stuff. Anyway, just an update from this side of the pond.
Yeah, I mean, if my answer to that is that the difference in virtual reality in having a higher degree of tracking is the expressiveness, the fact that you can use aspects of your behavior and performance to a degree that is much more nuanced. We do have, you know, keyboards are amazing, and that's one of the things that people realize with text adventures is that the expressiveness of a keyboard was sort of out of step with the level of complexity that people can put into a game. And so text adventures were actually a very uncanny valley kind of moment because of the way that we tend to expect to be able to express ourselves through text versus the expressiveness and the nuance that was available as a response to that system. So, you know, that's why it was so niche, is because of that sort of the compromises that a person had to make in terms of being able to kind of get an appropriate level of sort of willful suspension of disbelief. Because if you're writing to somebody, you expect writing back, and writing is a complex form that has lots of different sort of attributes that depend on what you put in yourself. But yeah, as I've said before, I think that the benefit of virtual reality is not being able to go to Mars, not being able to be a superhero, but to be able to have what it is that your hands do be represented, to be able to have space represent things, and to be able to put things in space that can represent things, and pulling it back to that level of mundaneness of its definition, I think is really instructive and important, because the Mars stuff, that's fine, but it will cease to be impressive at some point in the future. But the space, as in the location stuff, won't cease to be true. And so I think putting things in space and making movement mean things are the unique value propositions of virtual reality. And as such, you know, technologies come online where people have the ability to do eye tracking or actual face tracking, where people can do voice input, then those become very useful components of it as well. You know, Oculus has announced the intent to be able to do full body tracking in front of a mirror. I think that's really, really interesting, because it means that while it's constrained in its context, it means that you can have a much fuller degree of expressiveness reflected through that surface and into a performance. But, you know, I think the challenge is, how can we make those things meaningful? How can we make sure that rather than merely sort of providing sort of an extra degree of immersiveness, for whatever that means in the simulation, it actually does something that has a semantic relevance that is important to somebody in a way that they depend on it. And how can we make that their jobs? You know, that was the thing with VisiCalc, is that it permitted double entry bookkeeping and other or much more automated forms of bookkeeping that, you know, kept people honest, but also increased it. What it ultimately did, and I think Kay has talked about this and other folks, is that it increased the level of complexity that people could keep in their heads, because the complexity was in the document, was in the computer system. And so when we can force complexity and mitigation and management into the system, then that'll allow us to increase the level of complexity that we have on our side. So yeah, that's where I put it, and I'd be curious as to other people's responses to.
The issue of complexity is a really pertinent one. I think about that often. You've reflected on it in different ways. One thing, though, that I think would be really interesting to get a bit of consensus on is when these things will be used. So Apple apparently has been saying that their initial stuff, they don't expect you to sit with it all day. It should be used in relatively short bursts, which is a little bit telling. I find that interesting. So with the interactions I've been having recently, what I find is sitting down and concentrating on my rectangle. I need a better name, but concentrating on the rectangle is great for normal writing and reading. Probably nothing will ever get better than for basic reading a few sentences than a rectangle, whether it be AR or physical. But then when we look into the AR/VR space, I don't think a lot of people will have an entire room where they can interact. That'll be very specific work. The average office worker won't have that. So it seems to me that the whole focus of AR to begin with makes sense. Because if you imagine we have a shared area around us, in Oculus, we have this Guardian thing. Imagine that in front of us, we have a public space. So if we take our knowledge thing in the graph or whatever it might be, and if we have a meeting, that's the shared area. But the other stuff we have, maybe on the walls or on the table or floating, is not shared. Because it probably wouldn't be the same layout room, so it may not even fit. So if we take that as one thing, that most likely when you go into AR, you'll be at your desk, but you'll stand up. Because sitting down is a bit of waste of space, but you will stand up, you'll do the things, maybe not walk around a bit. We need to decide on how we feel about that. And the issue along with that is, of course, what data will we have? But interaction-wise, the more I play with it, how can we get rid of the data or hide it? I think becomes more and more crucial. Because it won't be that hard to have the entire Wikipedia thing on music or whatever it might be over in the room like they're an incredible sculpture. But it's bad enough with a cluttered desk. Once you start building a this there and a that there, it's going to be really mentally taxing. So what is the logic we'll have for exploding something and then pulling it back? And then maybe you take one aspect of it out while you read the rest of it closed. I think these fundamentals we try to address a bit of dialogue on. But before I go over to the hands, just any indication of whether you completely agree with me or completely disagree with me, that what we're basically talking about is stand-up VR, not walk around. And the key thing is what's in front of us, because that can be shared, not the room, because that'll probably be owned by some company.
Well, that's a new idea to me.
Okay.
Interesting.
Brandel. Okay, yes, Bob, go on. I'm sure we'll get back to that point as well. So Bob, yes.
It's a new idea to me. I'm taking it that the problem of disorientation between standing up, moving around, and how it feels in your body is assumed to have been solved. What I've heard, I haven't been following this, but what I've heard is that it's still a problem. Is that right?
The way I would characterize it is virtual motion is still extremely sickening. So if the frame of reference changes on you without you being the person specifically perambulating, that is sickening and will continue to be. It is off by default as the way for all of the shooting games, everything like that to do. I've never, as much as I've tried to sort of tamp down that as a nausea response, I have failed. But what I don't find sickening is walking around in a space in that sort of guardian bounds, as Frode pointed out. Yeah, other people may, but I have not actually in the last sort of 5 years of working in VR.
I agree with you, Brandel, and that's
Okay.
also what I hear from other people, that if you make your own movement, it's fine. The only thing, I mean, of course, VR will be fantastic for room scale, whether we'll have to get the table and so on. But I'm just thinking about in terms of, let's pretend it's a year in the future, Apple has announced their device, going to be some sort of an AR device. Chances are it won't be used for room scale. Chances are, I really, and this is, I'm making assertions. If you don't agree with me, I'd really like to hear. Please understand that I'm being just a friend making assertions. That'll be the whatever thing can be semi within hand's reach that people from different parts of the room, so to speak, can interact with. But Yeah, Mark, you're itching to go, I can see.
No, a couple of things is one, just picking up on the last thing, was that it sounds to me that this issue of frame of reference and the moving is a bit like sort of overcoming seasickness, in the sense of your eyes are telling you one thing and your ears are telling you another. Most people find that disconcerting. Some sort of learn to overcome it. Mariners and aviators certainly do, but that's often through a lot of immersion. And in fact, and an interesting thing here is, of course, one of the ways you get around it in something like at sea is you just go and stand somewhere where you can see the motion. But of course, you can't do that in the VR because it's not actually natural. And I've now completely forgotten what it was I thought I'd written it down.
No, that's a good point, Mark. And it's, sorry to jump in, but it's an important sort of component of a lot of the critiques of virtual reality in general. People talk about gorilla arm as though it's some kind of immutable, terrible thing. So yes, seasickness, and even people do crazy things to their eyes. Apache helicopter pilots learn how to disconnect the focal distance so that they can look in two different places. That's one of the reasons why young children are supposed to not spend extended times in the VR, because we want to have the emergence accommodation coupling. The fact that our eyes focus at a certain distance when they converge at a certain distance. And the thinking is that it's possible that they may lose the ability to have that hard coupling to the same extent. Certainly it's something that I am able to break to some extent that will. But it hasn't harmed my ability to make focus. But also with the gorilla arm, that people say people will always be sick of doing things up their arm. But the fact is that there are people in the world who have jobs that do that. That's why Bill Buxton calls it painter's shoulders instead, because painters do it and they survive. It's sore, but then they get good at it. So the basic plasticity, that's mechanical plasticity rather than my favorite neuroplasticity. But the fact is that we're plastic enough that if there's a value proposition to be had in any kind of context, no matter how unnatural, no matter how painful, frankly, we'll adapt to it and we'll use it. So that's, I think a really good point about seasickness.
Just to round out very quickly on that is, I think you're right. And I mean, certainly one of the things I noticed is when I used pass-through, it reminded me very, very much when in a former life when I used to use passive night vision goggles for work. Well, we needed them for whatever we were doing. But yeah, again, it's you lose sight sense of distance, and it's very floaty. The thing that I've forgotten, which I was going to mention because it's in context to this, is that there's an interesting sort of thing I thought I might find in sort of the Oculus store, which is basically hand training exercises. Because you used to do those things and you used to make shadows on the wall as children. Actually, I was quite surprised when I was using my hands against the controllers in the Oculus that actually I almost had better definition with the controllers than I did with certainly one of my hands. There wasn't quite the finesse that I'd have picking something up with my fingers just didn't seem to be there in the virtual space. I presume that's lack of force tailback is possibly what it is. I don't know, but anyway, just passing observation. But something that sort of I've seen the ham physics lab and things, but that seems to be more about exploring the experience than teaching you to do things with your hands. In other words, training you to use them with purpose in that space. So there's an app for someone to make.
Peter.
Okay, I was wondering, Brenda, do you know whether anyone's tried to see how well actual sailors do in VR environments, and also whether anyone's tried taking Dramamine tablets or seasickness meds to see if that would affect having your point of view moved on you?
I haven't. I'll see if anybody around me knows, but that's the sort of thing that I would expect to be a very interesting subject of investigation for folks like Jeremy Balanson at the Stanford Human Interaction Lab. So that would be one place I'd look for it, but I don't know myself. And obviously, all branches of military, I think that they've done a phenomenal job of investigating various forms of interaction over the years, and so it would be my expectation that there may be some leads in there too. But no, fascinating, but I don't know.
So, kind of on that point, that other point, I feel I'm kind of in the phase of being actually both excited and quite depressed dealing with this, because the opportunity is immense if we can do something good. But it's also depressing, like coming from my own background, who the hell am I, right? What credibility do I have? What credibility do we have as a group? Obviously there is real credibility here. I'm not, in any way talking none of us down, but
it's okay. I just sell watches, like I say.
But the point of that is, if we're going to, we need basically an Archimedes lever type thing. It was him, right? Wasn't it? The find a place to stand. And I'm very excited by discussions of extreme use of VR. It's something like in Jaron's book I can read about and so on. I'd love to go and do all those RT and military and hardcore things. However, I think that if we are going to make a real difference, we have to go to what's mundane. That's what Randall said, I think last time and before. And sometimes that worries me, but then I have to look at my own situation. I made software, author, and it's just not selling well. I know it's because I'm not doing enough marketing, so I'm not trying to talk myself completely down. That's not what the point is. But the point is, if we do build stuff that is really for the advanced cybernauts, what is the market for that? And I don't necessarily mean sales, I also mean cognitive markets. And that's why I'm talking about where will this stuff be used? And that's why I introduced it today with, I really do expect when someone spends $2,000 or whatever on the first Apple VR, because that's our mental model that we're designing for that, whether we will or not, when will they use it? Some people will use it for engineering and all kinds of specialist users, fine, there will be software for that. But for the average knowledge worker, office user, and academic, when will they use it? I think we have to really figure that one out. So it has to be, and I really hate this because, of my Doug background, it has to be about the casual use a little bit, but with a really good learning curve, right? Yeah, I saw, Mark, you were frozen with a big smile, so it wasn't the worst freeze. Anyway, so if we can just for a little bit, just push the discussion towards the devices come out. We have a friend who works within some kind of knowledge stuff. They call us up on the phone and says, "Hey, you're a nerd. Should I buy it?" And then we say, "Yeah, are you kidding?" And then we'll say all the specs, of course. But then we'll say, "And the thing you can do with it is ... I would really like to hear about that little ellipsis. Anybody have any thoughts? Or Bob and Peter, would you like to go first before we address that?
All right. I wanted to hearken back to one of your earlier comments, Frode, because I happened to have the chance to be in the very first virtual reality lab that was around at the University of Washington, which was run by a former military commander who had run into it in cockpit design. And we had a very early conference. This is in the early 1990s. We had a conference and the paper that I wrote, you'll be interested to know, was as soon as virtual reality gets really interesting, it will have enough complexity that we're going to have maps to get around in it. And so I did not go to work on virtual reality. I went to work on, as you know, mapping of various visual kinds. I think that's still the case, and it was fascinating to hear you, make that as part of your introductory remarks here. I think that that one of, as I've written in volume 1 of Future of Text, the ability to be able to map out very, very complex spaces is still one of the huge challenges that we have in the world, and it will be helpful in virtual reality whenever we solve that problem.
Yeah, thanks, Bob. I'm just writing a note on that. Peter?
Well, when I was at Syracuse in the early 90s, we had the advanced, graphics research laboratory and VR lab in the bottom of Heroid Geology Laboratory, and I was able to get down and make some use of that. And one of the first little widgets that I built, we were using SGI Iris computers, and I wrote sort of like a little, almost like a 3D map widget. One represented a vector showing which way you were looking within the ground 3D space from your position. The next one showed where you physically were within the bounds of a 3D volume. So one fly point was where you are in the volume. Another fly point was a vector indicating which way you were pointed in the volume. And then I was looking at maybe allowing you to navigate by dragging that fly point around as opposed to using the other controllers. Also, it occurs to me that we might want to bring the command line into VR, because a lot of things are much easier to describe textually than to deal with through direct physical or virtual physical interaction. My other thought as far as a big killer use case would be managing a virtual library. I have so many digital assets in my Mac that it's utterly mind-boggling. And at the moment, I'm just dependent upon throwing everything into DevonThink to index it and search it. But it would be really nice if I had a uniform spatial artifact that I could put in a virtual VR library, so I could start to do the memory palace kind of organization. So I could actually have the sense of, if I'm looking for this kind of a digital asset, here's where in this space I would have left it, so that I can narrow the field. For instance, when I was trying to find that book, it even happened in my real physical library, there were a couple alternate locations that it could have been in, and I checked the wrong two first until I found the correct section of the library that I'd shelved it in. Now in the VR space, that wouldn't be a problem, because I could have one copy of Shank's book organized in the AI section. I could have another copy of Shank's book dropped in the business section. So now there's more than one representation of it, and each one is in a different physical, well, virtual physical space of that appropriate area of organization. So I think that could actually be a sweet spot. So instead of just having, half the world sitting buried somewhere in your hard drive and trying to find it, it would be as if those were actual books again, and you could use all of your book organization skills from your real world physical library and apply them in a virtual space.
That's a really good idea. I'm wondering if anybody has tried it out in Second Life, which is sort of a simulation of virtual reality.
Oh, Second Life is just so awful. Well, there were two kind of comments on there. On the first thing with maps, yes, I think there will be some mapping. Of course, it'll be useful for actual things, but the digital library, basically the Finder, I think that will be absolute key, because every scenario I write for you, Brandel, because thank you, you're a good role model for me to write for. It ends down with, I have a shape of stuff. Now, where does it connect to other stuff? Right. So basically, we're talking about the Finder. We're talking about the desktop. We're talking about the library. We're talking about notes, call it whatever you will, but we're talking about the entire universe of that user's knowledge. So how do we cluster that, and how can we share it, and how do we manipulate it? How do we choose what to view and what to hide, right? Yeah, I completely agree that that's the way to go. But even within that, there are so many fundamental issues of styles of visualizations and interactions and so on. So I think that in the community, we need to make a few decisions to begin with. And the number one is what I've been kind of harping on about a lot in this conversation. I think we should talk about something that is above your desk. It can fill the room at some point, sure, no problem. But we can imagine the Apple TV commercial, where they have, I put on my glasses and I have magical things here and there and there, and I put them away, I go somewhere else, and maybe it's different in that other location because I've chosen to have different layouts at home and in my office and so on. But I think it needs to be that level of casualness to begin with, because even having a couple of shapes in front of you, the complexity of how we deal with that is just ridiculously immense. Brandel, I'm sure you have a billion better things to say.
Not better, just more talking. Bob, have you ever come across Maxime Cordial's work within sort of University of Monash?
Say the name again.
Maxime Cordial, I just put his website. He's at Monash, and he did things like ImAxes, the immersive axes kind of representation of being able to manipulate data series, time series, and other fairly complicated data sets in virtual reality. Really, really interesting. The point that I was thinking about when you mentioned mapping is that, depending on how reductive you get to it, I think that mapping is basically the only problem to solve in VR, because it's the only problem. It reminds me of when I was talking to my daughter at a playground recently, and some kids were moving some colored cones around in various sort of elaborate sequences, and I said they were coding. And she asked why, because she knows what I do is coding, but I was saying that they were making things mean things. And I think, and while that can be an obtuse level of reductionism, I think it's still useful to point out that making things mean things is both mapping and coding. Coding is the productive component of it, and mapping or map using is the consumptive component of it. But that which sort of both broadens it to near meaninglessness, but also points out what sort of moving parts you have as a consequence, what sort of capabilities you may be able to kind of look at. And that's, one of the things I really loved about, there was an organization in the UK called Schultz and Webb and later Berg, and they played a lot with things like Chernoff faces. The idea that if you have multivariate sort of data that you represent as something approximating a human face, then we have an incredible capacity to parse all of those things because of the fusiform face region of the brain being such an inordinately large part of our cognitive capacities. And so mapping, yes, is absolutely important, but it's also worth stepping back to think about what it is that a map is, what kind of capabilities it confers, and then meshing them against the sort of the hardware capabilities of the moment, the expressive and the display capabilities that we have in front of us. And so, yeah, I absolutely agree, and I think that it allows it sort of it makes us it forces us to be holistic about what it is that the totality of it is. On the subject of books and placing them in spaces, that is why I have gone so deep on trying to render books in ways that can kind of represent multivariate dimensional aspects of those books, because I think that another aspect of this is that because we live in reality most of the time, most of us, we are accustomed to the nuance of the sort of the actual appearance details of the book, such that it might actually be worthwhile for us to really layer that dimensional kind of information about what a book is into that book, such that we believe it, obviously, but also so that we can read aspects of what that book is into it in ways that don't require a number of bar charts floating next to it saying like age, quality, all of that kind of stuff. Page count, like, no, the page count is the thing. The quality is whether it looks like it's beaten up. So yeah, all of those things. But I'm excited about the ways in which we can attack them as a consequence of the media.
I'll ask you again what about that the last name of the person whose first name is Maxime.
Yes, Cordial, Cordeil. I put a link to his personal page in the chat.
Personal page.
Mark?
Yeah, the sites.google.com.
Yeah, it was just a very quick observation, really, and just thinking the thing we were talking about. There's reference earlier to this idea, mind palaces and being able to sort things out. So there's an interesting part of one sort of aspect of this whole mapping thing is the passage from personal map to public map. So I may use this visual space in a very, in a sense, not necessarily intentionally, but in a very personal way. Of this thing in this place has a very particular meaning. I'm very much an untidy desk person. I know where things are because that's just where they live. And so I'm spatial and visual in that sense. Definitely not the sort of person with a empty flat top desk. So people will have their own storage mechanisms. Now, of course, that will map to the individual. But in order to interact with somebody else, I have to then that's the passage out from me. That is there's no point me taking my sort of visualization of it as such. Whatever odd shape and particular spatial position will mean nothing to another person. So there's an interesting sort of mapping challenge there in that, how we wrap it and unwrap it. So we pass the relevant part to somebody else who will then probably want to wrap it up themselves in their own representational manner that makes sense to them.
My experience is that you need to be able to make the maps with on actual problems at this stage in where we are. You can do an awful lot of very, very abstract envisioning of various kinds, but you need to be able to work with a team of people on an actual problem or a set of problems to make real progress on this kind of mapping.
I guess it depends a little bit on what kind of mapping, and that's obviously really, really important, because if we're talking about actual books that are published, at least we have the size on the cover, just to take a trivial example. But once we get into more kind of cognitive mapping, defining what the different dimensions are and so on, will be a very interesting common issue. Yeah, sorry, Peter.
Yeah, I find that the secondary characteristics of books are a real important finding aid to me, because I know whether a book's a thin book or a thick book. So even if I'm too far away in my library to be able to actually resolve the writing on the spines, I can go by the general shape and color to zero in on where I need to climb up on the step ladder to get close enough to actually read the title to find the one I'm looking for. Another thought is that we might want to have something like the original Memex arrangement in our VR workspace. So imagine everything off to left of center was one view, and everything off to right of center was a second view, and dead center were some VR controls to allow us to build links between the items, so that I could navigate independently to one section in my memory palace in the left view, a completely different section of the memory palace in the right view, grab two items, and then create a relation between them.
I wonder if there's a way of combining. I like the idea of this, and I also experienced that in my library. Digitally, there are now there's at least one place, and I understand there are others which I'm not familiar with, at the Internet Archive, where there are 1 million books that have been digitized. Now, there's, how can we experiment with that kind of a space? It would seem to me that it would be possible, that the Internet Archive people, whom I know some of, would be interested in that, and it might be easily, well, not easily, but might be fundable as a realistic project to build some kind of mapping of knowledge with that as the starting point.
I think we need to address a little bit more in these meetings, which are always inspirational and very, very pleasant. It's very easy to go into that problem or this problem. I think we need, other than, we're going to build a library or a word processor or whatever. I think we need a little bit of discussion around what problems we're trying to solve. So for sure, one of them is how to organize your stuff. And absolutely, an aspect of that is this. Yeah, Mark?
We're slightly going around in circles in a sense that I think Bob was absolutely right. We do actually need to put some data into it. It's not that the data's scary or something, and it doesn't mean we can't do other things, but we won't get started if we keep talking about generalities. So there are a number of things. I'm not
talking about generalities for a second, Mark. It's quite the opposite.
Well, no, we have, because we've just, before I spoke, we just flipped from the sense of, so let's, sort of that here's some data we can do something with, to saying, yes, but we don't want to be too specific. And I'm just saying that it's not being specific to say, look, here is something we can actually, that's tractable, that we can go and use. Otherwise, if we don't take something that's available, or we don't take a real sort of problem or data set now, then everything becomes everything becomes abstract, and we can dream as much as we like, but we won't get anywhere because we never test our ideas. So it's not that by picking this bit of data or that bit of data, we're in some way cutting ourselves off, but it's that we're actually making specific progress, because out of that we'll have other ideas which will allow us to branch off. But I think as long as we keep stepping away, so we mustn't look at this because it's too specialized, then I don't think we're going to make much progress.
I'm not saying it's too specialized. What I am saying is that the story about the looking for your keys under the streetlight, because that's where it's easier to look. Just because we have the data doesn't mean it's helping solve the right kind of problem. I really do think.
So just to understand, so you're saying, for instance, so all these books that we might use, that's looking under the light, is it?
Because we have access to that data, yes. I'm not saying we shouldn't do it, not at all. But what I'm saying
But
is,
you want to use data that we haven't got, is that what you're saying?
I think we should focus on Mark's data set. He spent so much time cleaning it up. It's probably the most effective device to be using to explore the problem.
Well, that
hang on,
for me, I know I haven't been a part of this discussion for, well, several months. So I didn't even know we were going to be talking about virtual reality. And one of the things that I've found is that the best way to make progress of one kind or another is to be able to well articulate what the problem is that we're working on. And I see that we're kind of running around that, but to well articulate means to write down and propose in text, probably, or put in text and diagram, or we will continue to move to do different people's issues. By the way, I ran into there's a which something I can send to you when I'm on my downstairs computer, Rhoda, and you can circulate to people if you want to. There is the people who are the chemists and biologists who are working on the future of life problem have a GAPS a web page, and they've invited people to write down what are the gaps, and they've got a list of they've got a classification of these gaps of about 20 of them with contributions. I haven't joined the organization, so I can't, I have to join it in order to read the gap, what people actually say in the gaps, but they've got a list of the gaps right there, which I can send you, which may be a model for what we might try to do with this project.
Yeah, sure. Brendan, we haven't heard much from you today. Right, anything else?
I'm personally very interested in trying to pursue archive.org. I posted a link to the Twitter post about my Gutenberg project. If you haven't seen it, Bob, I built something that opens up Gutenberg e-texts and turns those into digital books with the appropriate cover and content, so that you can actually flip through them, and their length is proportionate to the actual page count, so that there is a page per page and you flip them. It's pretty fun. Unfortunately, Gutenberg doesn't directly have an API, so that you have to download those books in order to be able to do that. But one could sort of create some kind of interstitial between that and the entire corpus of Gutenberg if one was willing to set up a server for it. That would mean that you could create something that has some representation of all of the books and some ability to be able to kind of process a way of reordering those things. A vision of mine that I had in the very early 2000s, 2003, 2004, was to have that library, but actually have it be able to move, so that the books actually changed their position based on the relative weighting, similar to something that I saw possibly at the symposium. There was I think a demonstration of a dynamic weighting, two-dimensional structuring thing that I thought was really, really interesting. One of the greatest benefits I find for virtual reality is that you have simply more space and a more nuanced vantage point from which to be able to kind of view that space. And so I think that those visualizations that are interesting but become quickly visually complex are some of the lowest hanging fruit to explore within three-dimensional space that we actually have such a native way of being able to manipulate. I mean, the downside is that it's only one more dimension, and so if you're talking about something that's many more high dimensions than that, then you only get one. You can get I get a couple if you start to use color and things like that. But so that it's not a free lunch to all complexity, but merely an additional dimension. But I think it's a good start.
Thank you. Very interesting. I didn't know about it.
So something that I'm sort of reminded looking at that is interesting that came out from the visualizations we did sort of last year. That actually Adam did for us. But one of the things that came out almost accidentally in this was just the idea of reducing the sort of visibility almost of things. So it's like, I suppose in games you have this sort of fog of war sort of effect. This is here, this is the known bit, and beyond there, here be dragons. And they're there because it's sort of showing you what you've explored. But in another way, it's reducing the complexity of the picture you look at. If we could see everything in the Gutenberg library sort of thing, it would be overwhelming. If we could, in a sense, if it was portrayed to us, so we literally could see every wretched thing. And it's the same when we've been sort of discussing, well, if I could take part of Wikipedia, something big like Wikipedia. I think what's really interesting is part of the thing is being able to foreground, a book or part of a book, in fact, or part of several books that have a connection without having to be encumbered by the rest of that thing. So they're not disconnected, they're not lost. The disconnection, if there is one, is simply achieved by, in a sense, putting them back into that background. So they're not overloading essentially, and we can concentrate on the bit at hand, because it seems to be one of the things that sort of comes across that we're trying to do in this sort of virtual space, regardless of the number of dimensions, is being able to, I think, to scratch the itch of our strong associative connections, that we make so easily in here, being able to externalize and say, yeah, because I want that bit of that one, and I want that bit of that bit, and that's sort of in a sense what we do in here. We pull those together and we turn them over, and so we are arguably approaching a point where we sort of theoretically should be able to do that, but we obviously haven't built all the affordances for it yet. So this idea of, so I think I see it, so it keeps coming forward to me, this idea of having, it's not a firm bounded space. It is almost like something receding into the fog. It's sort of there, you're aware of it, and you can push out into it if necessary, or you can pull on some connection to pull in more, depending on the style of work. But it's a method that allows you to keep the thing you are interested in centered, foregrounded for you. I don't know, but there may be something in that.
What you say sort of reminds me of a little episode a few months ago. Some postdoc and pre-doc students at Stanford had decided that they were going to launch a major understanding of change, and they were calling it the Meta Change Project. And I said, "Oh well, you know, what are you reading?" And I said, "Oh well, we're making an annotated bibliography." And I said, "Well, you know, could you send it to me?" He said, "Well, you know, it's not complete." I said, "Well, I'm not going to send it to anybody or anything like that, but I just thought I'm interested in change, and so simply just send it to me." So they sent it to me, and it was terrible. The writing was terrible, and I realized that there were two things that somehow that I liked, at least, that they hadn't run into. One was structured abstracts, which are used in the medical field, in all the major medical journals for the last, I don't know, 10 or 15, 20 years, which are much easier to read, and you can scan and skip because they're segmented and have various headlines, you know, boldface or headlines of different kinds. And by the way, I intend to write for volume 3 something about structured abstracts, because I think if all the journal editors in the world required them, as the medical people do, we would save about, my estimate is somewhere in the order of 5 to 10% of all the scientists' time in the world. The other thing that struck me when I was dealing with these young chaps was that that some of the things that they had abstracted, I had the books on my shelf. I went over to the books, I looked at the books, and I saw that the table of contents in some of the books, was much more accessible and usable in the sense of, could I get to what I wanted faster, or decide whether I wanted it or not. But then, of course, some of the tables of contents were of the kind that I guess book editors want you to make very interesting and flashy and enticing and so forth, but not very informative. So there's another opportunity, a near-term opportunity of creating tables of contents for the million books on Gutenberg and on the Internet Archive, simply to be for us to be able to scan and skip to what we need, and probably then to with a little bit, not a whole lot of artificial intelligence, put together very interesting ontologies and other things. That's so. Anyway, I'm gonna at least write about structured abstracts for volume 3 of the future of text.
I think it's very interesting what you're saying about the table of contents, because I've been reading a lot of books in the sort of last 6 months about indexing and things like that. I think that really comes across as how it is a complete antithesis of the AI person's view of the world, where everything is reducible to absolutely fixed elements. Indeed, I'm just reading Is That a Fish in Your Ear about translation. And again, it just shows how mutable sort of textual symbols can be in a way that we choose to ignore, because normally our local environment is, what we don't see is we don't see that change or that confusion in our local environment, so we elide it. But there's a really interesting point, I think, about this this sense of tables of contents, which in another way is a bit like indexing, not in the formal sense, but in the way that a human created index has a salient to that something that's just done a find on a word doesn't help. You can do a find on a term and it finds you everything that's there, but it doesn't know about the context. It doesn't know, and if your word happens to have multiple meanings, then you're absolutely stuffed. And it's not, there's it's not that there's not cleverness in all that, but it's not what we as a human normally need, because we actually needed the more nuanced return. So there's an interesting point comes in that, well, in our writing, we don't tend to write for this sort of access. So maybe one of the sort of, C-level sort of Engelbartian things here is we need to sort of feed that into the loop. So part of what we're doing with text is, as well as, as well as general writing, we need, in order to help our sort of computerized selves, we need better extraction of that sort of table of contents indexing element to it. Because, as Bob rightly says, so some things you can immediately see, you can look at a book and say, oh, right, this is where I need to go. As opposed to saying, oh, there are 10 chapters and they all look equally boring.
Well, and yes, and if they're long chapters, then they need to have, then the table of contents needs to have subheads in them of some kind.
We need something akin to in the old book where it used to say at the top of the page, in which our hero encounters an obstacle and overcomes it. You saw these wonderful running heads that people had. It's not beyond the wit of man that in a sense that's not there, because I mean, it was a gloss and it was a performative thing. But in the same way, there's nothing to say that, because basically it's metadata.
Yeah. Well, the future of text is to use that old technology, that old methodology. And I think my impression is, when I looked a few years ago, that summarization, automatic summarization of text has moved along quite well. And it would seem to me that with another refinement, that one could build these tables of contents out of that kind of summarization. The summarization tended to produce paragraphs, which of course are hard to scan. What we want is a list of sentences, I believe, or at least long clauses, maybe occasional phrase, but certainly not just a word. For the table, for an ideal table of contents for 1 million books.
Yeah, because it's interesting. Most of our search systems are built to take anything you put in, no matter what syntax you try and put into it, to tear it apart into individual words, and then go and find as many matches to those list of words as, which is normally exactly what you didn't want to happen, because you're trying to cut down the mass that's returned to you by giving it more context, and your digital friend is doing its level best to give you far more context than you asked for. With good intent, but not to a great end.
Spread the word. We got some young folks are going to make a lot of money doing that. Mm-hmm. If they did a startup, and it would help the rest of us.
Yeah, it occurs to me that a table of contents and the main corpus of a book can be seen as two levels of detail of that text. And in computer graphics, we talk about level of detail as this sort of decomposition of polygon forms. But instead of having two specific stages, we normally have 3 or 4 or 5, depending on the level of fidelity required based on the view distance. Something that I think is really interesting is, given that we have these two enunciations of the level of detail of a book at the word level, and then at the although conceivably you could think of the annotated bibliography of something and its footnotes as being an additional level of detail. Then, but with a table of contents and the document itself, that's at least 2, and plus the annotations, it's 3. Being able to kind of interpolate and extrapolate across those to be able to come up with more continuous levels of detail, such that you have the ability to kind of see them at whatever range of granularity you like. I think that would be really appealing thing to do, because I think that the table of contents are very unsung heroes, and perhaps some of that is that most people haven't read Adler. how to read a book and
Yeah.
and understand the necessity of actually reading the damn TOC to see what it is that you expect to be getting out of a chapter. But yeah, I think that being able to one challenge with just having table of contents is that you don't have it's not ready to hand as a thing that can stand in for the book most of the time. People don't see it as being quite as important as it really is, or at least could be. And so, yeah, I like the idea of sort of reifying the actual representation of that TOC in a way that sort of brings it back to the fore and means that it's a handle to actually pull the book by, so to speak, rather than just a thing that happens to exist at the beginning. And at some level, it might actually be pretty good to have a book have the table of contents be a fold-out map that you get before it instead. Something that I did recently, because when I bought Technics and Civilization by Lewis Mumford, it was too big. It was too wide to hold comfortably. So I cut it in half because it was printed for me, it turned out, and I thought that was entertaining. That I ordered it and then it was printed the day later. But yeah, like that idea that what a book is and what you get to do with it is kind of up to you. It'd be quite fun to actually, for a really long book to cut it into chapters so that you have those as actual kind of reference ENS that you can use to kind of draw significance to it. You can pass those around, obviously, if you ever got to see people and again. But you'd also be able to kind of have individual meaning be attributed to those specific volumes. And so, yeah, I think I'll play with that. Thanks.
I just pulled out my copy of Technics and Civilization. And I'm looking at the table of contents. And the table of contents are phrases. They are not sentences, and they are not generally clauses. Sometimes they are just lists, like machine's utility and the machine, the monastery and the clock. Sometimes they are just not understandable. De Re Metallica is one of them. I could use a translation of that. The game hunt and the manhunt, and so forth. I won't read all the rest of them, but it would be interesting to have a really good table of contents of that book. Maybe you'll make one for us, and we can print it out and put it in our copies, and maybe we'll learn something from that.
What's interesting there is probably if those TOC headings actually had a subtitle to them. So probably, if you had an extra sentence that explained what the sort of, in other words, the short term, you mentioned one that, yes, I didn't mean anything to me, but I'm sure that, in a sense, once you read the subtitles, I get the heading, and also the shorter heading probably that's the bit you'll stick away in your head. So, and what that reflects to me is that, and I sort of thinking back on, having done a thesis recently, the longest thing I've certainly written was actually how little discussion, even if you ask people about it, there was about the writing. So it was broadly seen as a rather pedestrian thing where you wrote the first, I write the first chapter, and I kept thinking, well, how do you know what the first chapter is if you don't know what the rest of the wretched narrative is? And I don't mean, in a sense that you can't write it and sort of think, right, I've done that. I've written the whole of the introduction. You don't really know quite. You may know the overall story arc, but you certainly don't know the whole story setting out, because the whole thing is it's a voyage of discovery, both for yourself and for your reader. And so, and that just chimes back neatly with this thing that, I think that, I could have written a much better table of contents if I did sort of internalize this sort of thought at the time. So the table of contents, instead of being, it's often lumpily it's overly descriptive in an unuseful way. Okay, you start with an introduction, but what do you think? Yes, okay, it's the first chapter, but some of these things really don't tell you anything. So, or you know, in a book, then actually, it's not perhaps pertinent because in a thesis, okay, you have a sort of literature review, but even then, often literature reviews that I've come across don't really don't actually explain what they're doing. They just give you a list of things a person has read, which, if it's very, very tightly compressed field, is sort of useful, or it just tells you they haven't read very much. But you know, the joyful ones are where there's contextualization and the things of most interest are set amongst and contextualized to some of the, you know, and bounded by the other reading things. So it's that sort of structuring. And I suppose what I'm reflecting on here is it's something we sort of don't particularly teach in general, as you know, or not taught as we grew up. And if anything, becomes more needed now, because if we're going to step so easily in and out of a much more interactive textual environment, you know, before you just had to go and buy a book, you know, and the interactive part was turning the pages. Or if it really annoyed you enough, like Brandel, you cut it in half, you know, and just read a bit at a time. But that was sort of the limit. So the things we've been talking about now offer a much richer interaction. That's partly now limited because even if we took all our books of today, sort of dumped them in some magical digital hopper, and they arrived as digital artifacts, fully digital artifacts on the wrong side, I think what, you know, Bruce was reflecting on is that hasn't got us necessarily much further forward, because there are lots of them, unless they are truly sort of narrative works of fiction kind of thing, which is a whole different ballgame. But if they are in some way factual or explanatory, that they are missing a layer, they're missing a needed layer to make the most of them, if we're to use other than brute force keyword search.
And part of that is that for, let's say, all of science or nonfiction thinking, if you want to put it that way, we haven't formulated that as a problem, as a serious problem, as a really major, relevant, serious, significant. I don't know, I could go on with a lot of more adjectives, but folks, this is a really serious problem. And are we going to work on serious problems in this group or not?
I thinking about the tables of contents that I've had to grapple with in the past, it occurred to me that there are a lot of bad ones out there these days as well. And that part of it is that perhaps people haven't really sort of deployed it intentionally, like you were saying about a bad bibliography just being a list of things I've read because I've been told that it's necessary. And it reminded me of this talk I just linked in the chat by Walter Ong. It's the only one I got from actually him. I wanted to see if he'd spoken, there were any recorded tour of him doing a lecture tour about orality and literacy, but this one is about what's it called? Anyway, it's before he wrote that, but some of the thoughts are buzzing around. You can tell he starts by talking about apparently in university people sometimes have assigned an essay about what you did over the summer, and he thinks it's a terrible idea, or maybe it's at high school. And I mean, it is terrible. And he says it's a terrible idea because nobody's being given any sort of expectation of what it's for, who it's for, and why they would be interested. And I think that's a very interesting sort of component, both to a table of contents and a bibliography. If nobody's given you a goal of what a successful table of contents is supposed to do, then you'll either just defer to whatever formalism you expect, or you'll make up your own. And maybe that might be interesting, but there's a good chance that if you're already overworked, you'll do the minimum necessary in order to make it happen. So deploying an intentional table of contents is a really important component of making these things valuable, and yielding up some kind of way of making sure that artifact remains persistent and present, I think would be a really useful thing to do. Like I said, I actually think if you were to print out the table of contents and have it as a fold-out map next to the book, then that would probably change your reading of that book. And that's something that is pretty onerous for people to do for you, but it's definitely something that we can explore in virtual reality. and potentially, sell it to Simon and Schuster if they realize that it's a valuable thing. But yeah, a useful starting ground.
And we can also have
my
threaded.
view of human beings is that we will continue to have terrible tables of contents because everybody will want the freedom to do whatever they want to do, and or the marketing people will want to do frizzy kinds of things like that. So that's I'm still trying to help formulate the problem. And so the problem is that the problem / opportunity is that maybe building on the summarization type software, one could create roughly better tables of contents, not perfect ones. I'm never after perfect things because I don't think you can even measure anything perfectly. So, get over it. But that we could do something really useful and important and maybe even vital for humanity by formulating this problem even better and then working on it.
But in a sense, that's another happy artifice we now have, is that, the work that went into visual meta last year, although very fledgling again. So we have a vessel into which to put this richer metadata. And it's been really interesting to watch how Fred's author software has emerged as well, and so thinking about this, so making headings intentional rather than sort of like, I've written another page, I better have a heading sort of thing, because I think it speaks to the same thing. If your heading is sort of actually not used as punctuation, but rather as an inflection point or a focus point in the narrative, and that is flowing into the accessible metadata you're making, that gets very powerful, and indeed that can be and that can be further glossed as necessary, because you inherently have the structure on which to hang all this. And also links, and again, and funny enough, that also actually, it's nice to think the synergies there with the discussion, and again the stuff that's sort of come up in the discussion of author, which is concepts and glossaries and things. So these are sort of especially in a digital environment, these are dereferenceable. So whether they're traveling in the book or they're findable easily from the book, again you have that sense making sort of is at your hand. And I know way back, because it was Chris Gutteridge was talking about, in a sense, having access to a glossary that might be something of a Russian doll, because depending on your level of expertise, you might need to keep unpacking, according to your need to understand the problem. I mean, it's a really neat conceptual thought. I think delivering on that volume would be a massive task, but I don't think there's a reason not to start, because I think what it says to me is to start to think about a change in the way that we, I suppose, in essence, in the way we write. Our thought process in the way that we communicate. So we're not writing for a book that's so many folios long, and that we can only afford an index that has this many items, which are all these sort of constraints that really actually still bind a lot of our writing. I mean, I don't know, it'd be interesting to see a fly on the wall at some academic press or something as to that there will be all sorts of constraints like that, even if it's going to be the electronic book, because if I've learned anything from my very little sort of dealing with the publishing world, it doesn't move particularly fast. So it's not at the forefront. And that's not to speak ill of people. It's just that when you're used to doing something a certain way and it works, well, why tinker with it? Especially if you don't know what better there is to replace it. But I think what's coming out from the discussion today is some really interesting things that, if embraced, could actually improve that.
Well, I did that 50 years ago with information mapping, and which is also a subcomponent of what we called structured writing. Founded a company, built it into an international consulting company, trained 400,000 technical writers in how to do structured writing, with the main element of which is what you might call labeled paragraphs. And although there was a much more sophisticated taxonomy of sentences. Still exists, I think. I sold the company, I don't know, 30 years ago or something like that. Went on to looking into visualization. But you know that I didn't go in. I went for technical writing and business writing because people would recognize that it would be useful and would pay off, and it did. It paid off for me. Certainly, and the people who worked for me, because you know, we were charging people thousands of dollars for each, charging companies for each employee that they trained, and we didn't try to go into education because we regarded education as so conservative and stuck in its ways that we would never get anywhere.
Yeah, because I can see, I'm trying to remember the name, but I have your book from that.
Mapping hypertext.
Yep, that's it. It's actually it's just right at arm's reach, but yes.
Look at the table of contents if you wish sometime.
Yeah, because an interesting sort of hearing you describe this. I mean, because I can certainly see that. Yeah, the closer you get to the more humanities end of things, people said, "Oh, this looks far too abstract." There will be a natural pushback because and yet there's nothing antithetical about it. It's just about, you know, in a sense, say what you mean, you know, and do a little bit of abstraction, which frankly is no different to writing your glosses at the top of your, you know, your chapters, or indeed the top of the page, right, as they used to do in days of yore.
I still do. I'm still writing these. I every night when I read my book, I have my little pen handy to write glosses on the top of pages.
I'm curious, Bob, in terms of the company and what it did. Did you create software formalisms to make it sort of obligatory to supply that information, or was it more just a methods and practices kind of affair where you said to do this rather than having it as an obligatory sort of text field that people had to fill in?
Well, it took place so long ago in the Middle Ages that there was when we got a computer into our company, which was as big as my dining room table, the first one. We started thinking about software, and eventually we did create software which was mostly just aimed at enabling writers to format with great facility, rather than to demand that they do particular things. Because one of the things about taxonomy, which I claim to be to serve any kind of stable subject matter, by the way, that means any kind of stable subject matter in the world. We've trained 400,000 people and nobody's objected. And they must have been writing about different things, is one of my assumptions. That is possible. You know, it is also in that kind of taxonomy. What I learned was leave 10% undefined, because there's going to be a lot of loose ends in human thinking. But if you can cover 90% of the kinds of sentences that are actually written, and can categorize those in the taxonomy, you do very well. And, you know, the other 10%, well, people are creative. They'll figure out something to do with it. They'll probably, because they've gotten so used to putting subtitles on it, they'll probably put a subtitle on it. So you can check to see whether you want to read it or not.
Peter.
Yes, I was thinking it might be nice to have sort of a group shared affordance, not highlighting per se, just maybe a gesture, just like stroking over a region of the text that seemed particularly important to us, that could be aggregated over time without changing the appearance of the display. And then you could build up that data and use it to generate sort of a synthetic highlight over the course of the entire body of people who are looking at the text. So it'd be something very casual, just like drag your mouse about halfway down the page where there's something that you're finding is particularly useful while you're reading it. So you could come back to it, but it wouldn't be a highlight that would disrupt your normal reading flow if you were just trying to reread for content.
Actually, that reminds me, having just actually got a book the other day and I spent half an hour rubbing out all the annotations in it, which were not helpful. So I could just read the damn thing. So one thing you can do digitally, at least, is, you know, that'd be something you can turn on and off. But well, then the only thing, you know, it's not to speak ill of the last owner of the book. It's just that, you know, person A's annotations may not necessarily, unless someone is a student of the other person, be particularly useful to another reader. Apart from the fact that it makes the pages very noisy to read.
Oh, I actually have gotten a couple of used books where you could actually see the evolution of the person's highlight. It's like the first couple of chapters were done, you could tell probably some freshman student where 85% of a page would be highlighted. Then about a third through the book would drop maybe 50% of the page highlighted, and then only 5% by the time you got to the last couple of chapters.
Yeah, so they've given up after chapter 1 completely.
So Peter wrote here in the chat, making a lot of library excursions today. You may have noticed that I've been quiet for the last half an hour. Mark, I was really quite insulted when you said, should we use data we don't have? Because we are now under that street lamp again. A library is a fun and easy thing to do. We have, if we want to just have the community be general chat, that's one thing. But if we are going to have some kind of focus and some kind of aim, we've talked about your database, which is fantastic for the hypertext community. We're now talking about books. We talked about Wikipedia. We talked about the web. We talked about timelines. We talked about a lot of different things. And I have asked, I know I'm still recording and Bob is new. I was trying to be extra polite because Bob is not new to me, but new to this particular community. We do have Future Text Lab. And, you know, it would have been really great if you guys had written a basic bio. The only people who've written a basic bio is me and Vince, right? And this has to do with ownership. We have to decide what we are co-owning. If these chats are literally a coffee shop chat at Starbucks, that's one thing, and that's totally fine. But I think we need a little bit of agreement of where we feel we fit, because from my perspective, you know, like with all branding, what do we call the journal, as I sent in the email to that's probably quite easy. But if we are to seriously attack the problem of, and sorry, Bob, this community at the moment is very much about VR, AR work. Mm-hmm. Because before I gave in my PhD thesis, I didn't want to look at AI or VR or anything like that. I had to focus on basic text. And then Brandel comes along and ruins everything. So because of Brandel, most of us now have Oculus. And we're making the assumption that in a year or so, Apple will release some kind of AR, VR headsets. And we're using them as kind of a model, because they're very good at the consumer side of things. So I feel that I know in a year, there'll be something people can buy, put it on, stuff can be seen. Within that, there are, of course, opportunities, but what I'm very worried about is the ownership issue. And I don't just mean IP and technical, I also mean ownership of potential. So we know there's going to be meeting rooms and games, that's all going to be fine. But what we're trying to find out here is and this is kind of in the beginning of the discussion again, we imagine a friend calling up some kind of a knowledge worker, business, academia, it doesn't really matter. They are wondering whether they should buy this device. And we want to be able to say, yes, because you can do this thing in it. And the reason that is so important, and obviously, sorry guys, the rest of you have heard this a few times, but you know, when we had the first WYSIWYG machines with the GUI and all of that, once we had a word processor that became Word, innovation in word processing completely stopped. There hasn't been anything for 30 years, nothing. Right? And once we had a spreadsheet, of course, there's been some things behind the scenes. That is known, that is what it is. So if we don't now produce a mental thing for people that, oh my God, VR is not just hollow rooms or whatever it might be. It is something we haven't figured out yet. I think it's going to be a huge opportunity cost for us as a species.
That's what we've just been discussing for about the last half hour. It's all pertinent to exactly what you've discussed.
Yeah, with regard to the bio and things like that, Frodo, I may have sort of inadequately communicated the other day when I said that I was a near college dropout. It was not to be self-effacing. I obviously have a very high opinion of my output and my capabilities, but what it does mean is that writing per se and labeling what I am and what I do is a completely foreign concept to me. And what my intention might underpin that and what function it might serve for a broader community is something that I have very little context for. That's why I make, and that's why I put those things out there. But in terms of actually announcing what I am and what I do beyond producing those pieces of work, I don't know what it's for. So that's why I haven't leapt into it.
I can accord with that. And what I've done at the moment, and is basically just make a stub, because it's a start. So probably the thing that will help Fred at this point is literally, even if it's just mine literally is just a couple of sentences, and I will go back and put something in there. But then it's something, because one of the things I'm realizing out of this is, and I think it's probably going to fall into my lap, is one of the things we need is in a sense a table of contents of what we're doing.
Okay,
we have
Mark,
a number of things underway. We have the journal.
Mark, please let me just finish, please. Okay, you cut me off saying this is what we've been doing for the last half an hour. An aspect of what you have been doing for the last half an hour, of course, it is that, right? But I'm sorry for using that analogy again. It is looking under a headlamp right now, or a street lamp right now. Of course, to make a library will be worthwhile, and there is data available, and it'll be a good thing. But I really do think we need to look at the framing issues around that, okay? Because things like that, I mean, for crying out loud, like CD collections, since Mac version 1, there's been collection things out there. And I'm not saying they're not useful, but I'm saying other people will think of it. Maybe we end up doing it, but to really think of, to really step back and to look at this person in this situation, and we're kind of running out of time. I don't think we can do it today. I think it would be really, really worthwhile, because these discussions, one is on this topic and one is on that topic. That's all good. My feeling is I'm quite literally a nobody. So Brandel is putting his perspective. I have really no credibility, right? Apple has 2,000 people working on this. Meta just lost, what is it, $500 million yesterday or something because of issues. These are huge companies with huge resources to do huge things, right? So if we're going to have any kind of effect, it has to be so laser focused on something that other people really aren't doing. And that's why I get quite stressed out when we go into something that is really, look, the library thing, super exciting, super useful.
What library thing?
When we're, the library we've been talking about, how to look at books in the library, table of contents, all these things.
No. The comment about the library was simply that there is a data set. Oliver rightly pointed out, there is a data set that we can explore to give some actual sort of structure to what we're exploring. That's nothing to do with we're trying to make a library system. It's finding data that's complete enough and big enough to allow one to explore the thing. Otherwise, we end up with very broad hand-wavy objectives that don't get us to the objective you want. But
Mark,
I mean, the thing is,
seriously, this is so bizarre. I mean, Peter literally wrote, "We're making a lot of library excursions today." You know, the word library, the word has been used a lot, and there's nothing wrong with it. But earlier on, when by the way, Bob, Mark is one of my close friends, so we're having an argument. But please take that into context, and we're both very supportive of each other's work. But when you said earlier that what are we going to do? Work with data we don't have? That wasn't very nice, right? But the thing is, we need to find out whom to augment first. That means not just the type of person, but we need to know the kind of thing to do. And I think it is, there are many different data sources. I have, just like Bob suggested, we need to start writing things down. Brandel writes by making, Adam writes by making. I've written a longer article that I haven't been able to share with you guys because it's a complete mess. It's really, really hard. I would like to write this thing in some sort of a VR, AR environment. Right?
Try writing a memo instead of an article.
Yeah, I do. And I kind of shunt the executive thing here, and that's what I plan to share, not the whole thing. But the thing is, building these things is very, very hard, obviously. I've built Author, but the fact that I haven't solved these problems in Author, even, the fact that I'm problems writing something for you guys is really stressful. So therefore, to try to find the thing that will actually help us as a community, who to augment, because one of the things that was brought up, this is conclusion of my own paper as well, the finder, we need a VR finder. All our knowledge in there. And of course, Mark, I agree that we need real data. And the reason it's annoying to hear this from you is because you've provided us with one of the best data sets we have, the ACM Hypertext. It is very, very good. And as far as books are concerned, we have Google Books to search, and they give us all kinds of goodies. But at this point, we're sitting here with Brandel, who has deep insight of years of thinking, deeper than any of us new guys in here. And of course, a newbie perspective is useful too. We need, you all feel a little bit of what I feel, right? We need to find the right thing and then find that data to fit it. How can we help this friend of ours who makes the phone call by saying, oh yeah, but you can do this. We need to think along those lines, right?
Well, is this the, I'll just ask the question, is this the plan for the Monday and Friday discussions? I just dropped in, after having been away for several months, and this is a much smaller group than I was with a few months ago. And I'm not particularly interested in the virtual reality getting ready for Apple thing right now. So I probably won't be a part of it.
So the answer to that, Bob, is we look at it slightly differently, and the group varies a lot in size, but the ones that aren't the monthly or the annual, yes, absolutely smaller. And there has been some amazing work done earlier in the group. But the reason we're looking at AR, VR is, first of all, we think of it as just living in a space where you have kind of hologram amazingness, just mentally. This is not about you have to strap a thing on your head necessarily, but it is, from my perspective, it is the birth of a completely new medium. And until we live in it for a while and experience problems and have arguments like this, we are not going to know what it is. And the one thing that we have that the big companies don't have is we don't have a financial stake. Both Apple and Meta, this is billions of dollars for them. This is existential for them. All we really, and I think I'm speaking for the group, all we're really trying to do is find a way to show people that you can demand much more. And it's not just about how to move around the 3D space. I think your perspective and insights are relevant. I think you could be very much part of this conversation. From what I've heard today, you're talking about how to deal with the table of contents, hugely important. How to map things, hugely important. So, it's up to you. You're welcome to come in and out as you see fit. But for me, I am really scared that when these things happen, that'll immediately be labeled in people's minds as being something lesser than they can be.
As Frode pointed out, Bob, I sort of somewhat set the cat amongst the pigeons with regard to AR, VR, simply by sort of coming in and talking about sort of the fairly mundane uses of it. Being able to, something I built in 2017 was a word processor. Something I built in 2019 is a Wikipedia browser that allows you to linearize multiple tracks of Wikipedia articles into the dates that are relevant within them. So that you can look at the Wikipedia article on hypertext, look at it next to Xanadu, next to Ted Nelson, next to the Cold War and all of the specific technological developments that were driven as a consequence of various fundings. Brian Deere talks about the Sputnik moment and its impact on Project Plato, and it's really neat to see those things, because a lot of the time, unless you have intimate familiarity with those timelines, then you don't get to be able to kind of implicitly overlay them in your mind in a way to be able to do that. So the one thing that has happened of late is that because I am personally very interested in the way in which more space allows you to explore using that space to mean more things. That's sort of the center of massive discussions has gravitated toward things like augmented and virtual reality. But I absolutely agree that it's not essential to be the sole point. To Froda's point about worrying that ground will be lost immediately, without getting into too much inside baseball within the field, I don't think that's the case. As I've kind of mentioned in the past, practitioners within Facebook and within Google and within the place that I work don't have the slightest clue what to do with this technology. So I'm not especially concerned that the ground will be set, the cement will be set immediately at the instant that it lands. You're speaking and I can't hear you, Froda. You're not muted, but
I wasn't speaking. I was managing to shut up for once in my life. It's nice to hear that second half, but Bob, here's the thing. Whatever. I feel that I have, being amongst friends, I have seen things coming in technology for the last 20, 30 years. And I've talked about it. Have I been able to do something useful? No, not often, right? But yeah, a painter paints because they're a painter. It's not necessarily about being successful. So from my own personal perspective, I think that in, let's say, 3 to 4 years, we will all be living in augmented realities. We will have no choice. It's just like you were talking about that early computer in your office. And it does not mean we're going to throw away our laptops and our phones. Absolutely not. But I do feel that what will quickly happen is that the full virtual environment will be our work reality. Did you freeze, Bob? We lost him, didn't we? He looked so thoughtful.
Oh, yes.
He stopped blinking.
We've all been zoning in and out unintentionally, I think, today.
I was just going to tell him the thing about, we'll still need the 2D rectangles into this world, but that'll be our, anyway, whatever. But okay, how about this then, guys? Those of us who are unfrozen, that we try to write or think or something about something more around the frames of what we want to do by maybe Monday, something along those lines. I'll try to share my little thing, but well, actually, Brandel, let me just do a multiple choice with you since you have so much experience. Number one, are you leaning towards room scale or stand up by your desk for most of this stuff?
I think that there are really interesting opportunities in sitting. I think that a lot of folks who are playing with it, if you look at that YouTube VR example that was released the other day, that's expected to be sitting, so I think standing, sitting, walking around. My personal use case is I want to walk up and down in my backyard. I want to be able to walk the full length of my back, which is not incredibly generous. I live in sunny Silicon Valley, but I've got it. I might as well flaunt it. So my intention is to use it to walk up and down and to be able to codify aspects of that where I can pin things at various places along there. Quest, unfortunately, its bounds are a little bit short for that, so that I don't have the full length of, I don't have the use of the full length of the space. and it's a bit uncomfortable just in terms of the weight. But ultimately, should something with the ergonomics of it arrive, I will be walking. And I would love to make sure that we enable it, because I think something special happens when we move our bodies. So yeah, I would say while it is probably the better case for a lot of people, my personal interest lies in moving around in a space, and actually moving around quite a lot. And it's my hope, whether people's laziness sort of overtakes them there, but if we can bring it to be that it has utility to walk up and down to pace, I think it's not beyond people to be able to take that on in the event that it becomes useful enough to justify. And we might have, long corridor-like office spaces for people. You talked about whether people have the spaces in their lives for this. I was reminded of the work that was done in the early 20th century on completely refiguring the kitchen. The space was fundamentally changed. Bob, we thought you were very, very thoughtfully listening for a time there, and we realized that even somebody that listening as thoughtfully still has cause to blink their eyes at times. So
Yes.
Welcome back. But yeah, so I think that if there's call to change things, then people will change them. So that if office spaces need to have long walking tracks for people, that mean that they get a long strip that they can actually do walking in, then by God, we'll do it. I think the work from home kind of revolution that COVID has brought is sort of reminds us that what an office space is, what working spaces are, it ought to be up for grabs. And if this computing stuff works, then we might be able to change it so that we actually just all walk on sprinting tracks, but at a collegial kind of plod while we're doing our walk and talks and putting stuff in space. So yeah.
Considering you are very important to us because of your deep knowledge of this, both in time and in learning, that is of course important.
Nobody else agrees with me, by the way, but that's where I am.
Nobody what?
Nobody else thinks that way. Everybody thinks that we'll be doing VR sitting down, but I want to walk around.
No, I don't disagree with you for a minute. And I think that what Peter and Mark has been saying over time as well is, like memory palaces and stuff. I completely agree with you. I would like to do exactly that. But then there will be a point where you will need to reconfigure stuff to get the knowledge. Like let's say you have a bookshelf for a certain type of book in a certain room. At some point, you will need to pull out only specific things. Maybe that's the kind of interaction we should look at. Because placing something spatially, Apple seems to have solved that to a huge degree, not completely, obviously, because the glasses aren't out. But I was reading up on the current state of AR that Apple has made public. Crazy good stuff. It's just mobile phones.
Oh yes, in terms of ARKit as sort of mediated by phone and iPad. Yeah, no, there are really, really amazing things for persistent anchoring. And it's conceivable that those could go into a future technology that is able to integrate them more seamlessly.
But okay, so let's, for fun, because I think this is another thing we agree with. We want different libraries of sorts, whether it's our digital documents or books or notes or whatever. We want that library to be in multi-room scale. We want to be able to put things in our environment, whatever it is, home, work, wherever. Then we get to the point of taking some of that out, some of the aspects of that out. And that's why it was very frustrating with the discussion of table of contents earlier, because it is so very, very important. Maybe because it applies to this. I mean, I would like to be able to, okay, so in Author, one of the things I wanted is that when you save your document, you have to choose a cover. So you can see whether it's just a note or it's a book, that kind of visual stuff. I know Bob would relate to that. He's a very visual person. So in order to, and also Mark, sorry for doing all these name drops here, but Mark, you've been going on and on lately about people just putting in a bucket of knowledge. I completely agree with you that that's not useful. But you've also said another thing that I really want to highlight, and that is people no longer write for a medium, they write for remediation. So if we provide, let's take Visual Meta, for instance, you can save a book where it is really, really where it's really, really clear that the table of contents will be used in this amazing way, or you make a 3D sculpture out of it, or whatever. That kind of investigations, right? So maybe one of the things we can do is, yes, we'll have all these things we can have, but maybe we look at the production of a presentation and the consumption of it.
Yeah, I mean, that was my future text piece this year. Well, it wasn't. I'm not sure we are writing for remediation. I think it's happening whether we know it and whether we want it or not. Was probably the thing, and I'm aware that and since this is what we're doing here is aware that means it needs tools that we don't necessarily. Well, actually, tools and to a certain extent some human augmentation approach we just don't have at the moment. We are still basically thinking in print terms, living in a digital world. The metaphors and the sort of comfortable place we go to is, yes, we understand that most people, most adults have grown up with books around them. Not necessarily the whole library is full of books, but things printed in some way, or even if they're of a slightly younger generation, what they've had is digital facsimiles of print. So even if we've moved away from the physical medium, we definitely haven't moved away from the concept of that medium, and that's, I think, the real challenge that gets to the heart of the issues you're saying is that. How do we transform? That said, I don't think it's bad to talk about existing things that we have as models, because we have to move from where we are. We can't, it's not the old West Country term where you ask for directions and they say to you, well, you don't want to start from here, mate, and give you directions to the next village over, because that's what they know. So we do have to get from where we are. But that's why I thought today was interesting. So we were reflecting on the fact that so you could take something as pedestrian as a table of contents, but if you begin to meld that into the likes of visual meta, suddenly you've got a whole different, you have a much richer thing to play with, and you can begin to let go of the old legacy. And you don't have to call it a table of contents or something, but you're getting closer to your idea of the concept map and the glossaries and things. So to me, I see a very happy, gentle, ill-defined, but potential line of advance through that. I suppose, coming from my first background, at sort of C, where you learn that if you don't pay attention, things bite. And so I'm ever the pragmatist in the sense that, to a certain extent, we've got to work with what we've got. And I wasn't being totally flippant when I said, well, do we look for things we don't have? It's not. So what I was reflecting there is that, the point is we may not have what we want, but if we don't know, if we can't express what the things are that we don't have with sufficient fidelity to get going on them, well, we might as well work with something we've got until such point that we get a moment of sudden clarity. So again, I don't think these views are antithetical at all. But the ability of the kind of things that, to my mind, that Brandel and Adam can do, which I certainly can't in doing clever things with code, with information, is at the end of the day does depend on that. So again, that's why I didn't think reference to having lots of stuff in the Internet Archive is a bad idea, because it's just something to lean against while you sketch out this much broader vision. Otherwise, it just has nothing underpinning it. Well, that makes it very hard to deal with. It's so abstract.
Mark, not necessarily. I see you have your hand up, Peter, but the thing we were just talking about was the production and consumption side. And I'm wondering about, I'll just put the note in here. I saw, Brandel, that you've actually talked to Maggie Appleton recently, which is great. What might be interesting is talk to her about exactly what Peter suggested, some kind of a visual meta block translation or integration. And then we can work on packaging, because what we have really highlighted in this discussion, I think, is the importance of book covers. And I mean book covers in the deepest sense. For instance, glossary terms in a kind of a word map is a very useful thing to know about a book. All these different things, how it can be surfaced so that it can, on a virtual bookshelf, be useful information. So that's a point of starting with no data at all, but we have to produce it for our own documents. So that's what I mean, Mark. I'm not. Yeah. Anyway, but before Peter and Bob, Brandil, what do you think? Would you want to raise such a point or try to get her in a dialogue? Maybe get her to a meeting.
I suggested that she come. I think that she probably will come to the next sort of monthly. But in terms of what she's doing at the moment, it's a little bit more focused on the stuff that's happening at. I'm not sure if it's a Fog Creek or wherever, under whatever auspices she's working with Spolsky. So I don't know. I've made that invitation.
Okay, lovely. Peter.
Very good. Brenda, I was wondering, has anyone taken a look at how effective the omnidirectional treadmills are? Would they eliminate the problems with moving around, or having your viewpoint moved around without you physically moving around? Or would your body still realize that it's not actually being translated on the X and Y dimension because it's only being rolled back to a center point and have the same problems?
Yeah, so the issue is that the scale of treadmill that is required in order to be able to kind of because it's not just your feet, it's your vestibular apparatus, it's your sense of acceleration, linear.
Yeah, that's what I was concerned with.
Right. So in order to be able to do that and have that apparent motion, you do have to have a large enough treadmill that you can kind of counter with it. One thing that people have had relatively good success with is redirected walking and what's called saccadic redirected walking. So redirected walking only works when you're in full VR rather than in AR. But what it means is that you have rather than undertaking a turn of 90 degrees, you can change that to say 70 degrees or maybe even 180 degrees, where you increase the intensity of a turn, and some of your sense of space is impaired. But there's a company, I think unfortunately now has gone bust, but called The Void, where they had a large number of circular hallways that had a large enough turning radius that perceptually it felt like you were walking along an infinite corridor if they sort of continually returned you. People have done saccadic redirected walking, where because of the fact that we tend involuntarily to look at things like fireflies, flickers in our eyes, and also combine that with the fact that we're blind during that transitional period between those moments of saccade, that you can artificially stimulate those sort of sensory blind spots such that you can redirect a view, particularly while somebody is walking, so that they won't be aware of it and they will self-correct within a certain sort of small field of range, which means that you have this programmatic capacity for being able to direct people into specific spaces. And you can dial that up and down, in particular to avoid interperson collisions if you have a large enough space that you're mediating a large number of people within. So there's some really interesting pieces of work there. They only work in VR rather than AR because if you can see the real world, that all breaks. But it is interesting if you want to be able to kind of mediate a large number of things, or have one space code for another that you don't necessarily have access to.
Do you have access to any papers on that we could have a look at? I'd be very interested in reading about that.
Yeah, what I know is from WIST and Kai and VRFC. I'll take a look and I'll send them out.
Very good. Thanks so much.
Mr. Bob.
Yeah.
It might be useful in discussions like this to have an agenda that is and not necessarily a detailed one, but to discuss VR and AR all at the same time, for example, encourages people to jump around. And I get very, I get very excited about one thing and somebody else gets something and is just kind of hardly wait to change the topic. And so you can't go deeply into anything. And you can't go deeply into defining the problem, for example. So a certain part of this has to do with how how you want to have meetings happen. There are very well run meetings and ones that are just general brainstorming and so forth, and general discussions. And I think that it would be useful for some, at least, people to say, spend a half hour or an hour on AR, augmented reality. You're right, I agree, it's gonna be happening. What's gonna be, and is it, and some of the things that are learned in AR are gonna be taken into VR as well. And then we're gonna talk about what are the gaps in, or whatever, it's, in other words, there's and see if it's possible for this group to focus on making some progress on things.
Believe it or not, Bob, that is what we're trying to do.
Well, there are methodologies for facilitating groups, like agendas and saying things at the beginning, that this is what we're going to try to do for the next half hour or hour. Do I get everybody's agreement to that?
It's not that easy, Bob, in this context, because Brandel and Adam are both creators. And Adam, Swedish guy, wonderful, he's not here. He will make stuff that is really cool, but I have asked him to write something and he just won't do it. Right, same with Brandel, and it's for good reasons. They're not being hostile or stupid, far from it. They are extremely pleasant and extremely intelligent people. So when I then write what I think is kind of a manifesto, I have shotgun wounds to the side of my face because there's been disagreements, right?
Yeah.
And that's really, really difficult. That I have had twice now. I've had real, I write with my style, and I've been really shot down by it. And okay, that's been extremely unpleasant for me. But the point is, once we know what we're doing, and I think everybody agrees with your goal, Bob, of having some structure, that's fine. But we are such neurodivergent people here. We have very, very different ways of looking at the world and communicating, that there will have to be some punching the paper bag, so to speak. But I think today we did make a little bit of progress, because Brandel is the most important person in terms of knowledge, not in terms of direction necessarily, because of his experience, both in terms of using and doing the research. So when Brandel says that he wants to walk around the house in his garden, I have to adjust my thinking, because there's no point me coming here saying I want to do something completely different. And I completely agree with his point. I've written some notes along it. And I was just, a little tiny note here is, in our actual garden, there's one stretch that's 20 meters long. What I will be doing with Edgar, my son, when he's a little bit older, is put the sun on one place, like the size of a tennis ball, and then have the solar system to scale. Right, that'll be a fun thing for us to do. But of course, in AR, you can have myriads of things of that all over the house and the garden. You can have timelines and scales, and it'll be absolutely insanely incredible. So I think we're still in the phase, and it's hugely frustrating for me. And Bob, I actually think you're talking on my behalf, and I love you for it. But I still think we have to accept that we are not quite there yet to get to the more structured bit, even though I would absolutely love it.
Yeah, but I have to go now. I have a meeting now, but I would say I think that there's a sort of a necessary sort of discovery / honeymoon period with the new technology, and I'm excited that this discussion has ended up being sort of weighted toward my favorite subject of AR VR. But I agree with Bob that there are other ways of looking at things, and that there are other things where a lot of the stuff we talk about the mediation of different formats and structures and theoretical approaches to structuring that information pertain in all kinds of things, 2D and 3D and mixed reality. And don't forget, we've got projection and all other kinds of ways of doing it rather than head-mounted displays. So we don't need to worry too much about it. So I really, really appreciated your participation, Bob, and I would love to make sure that we can continue talking at a level of abstraction and toward a direction that would keep you here, because it's really a thrill to have your experience with creating things brought to bear against what we're sort of talking about here.
Thank you.
Thank you, Brandel. Have a good weekend. Rush your meeting, and yeah, look forward to seeing you on Monday.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
on that, but while he's logged off, while he's kind of logging off, don't forget, Bob, or maybe you don't know, sorry, we do of course have these videos on YouTube, which is a bit embarrassing at times, and we also have full transcripts. So it means that as we are punching around, that's how it is. And also this year, the book will be produced in a different way. We have a monthly journal. We have the first issue out, as you know, for January, which is, the first one was just a transcript of the main thing and then a tiny article. What I will be doing is soliciting articles, including, of course, from you, to go into the journal. And at the end of the year, they will be collated into the next volume of the book. So if your way of communicating and working is closer to mine, writing articles, trying to have a focus, that would be great. And these other guys can do something else. And then we fight in these things in the best possible way.
I just write memos these days because the way English teachers have taught us to write essays forever is dysfunctional for the most part.
You're completely right. I mean, it's more hypertextual to write the way you're talking. The reason TikTok is phenomenally successful is because it's little bits. Digital is little bits. Digital isn't a big solid thing. And
well, it's little bits that are structured and have labels and are spatially distributed. That's the frontier that we're actually at, in my view. That if we move into that as the adjacent possible, then we create a new reality, which then enables us to move on to the next possibilities.
indeed, I see the time. I also have to run, I'm afraid. But
Okay.
Thanks for being here, Bob. If you want to come in and out as you fit, that's super nice. If you want to write memos for the article, as an article, please do. Well,
All right.
It's so important that the contributions to the article is whatever the heck you want to write it. Don't go into a style that isn't you.
Oh,
Have a great weekend, everybody.
I'm focused on the ability of trying to improve the ability of some of the better thinkers in the world to improve their thinking. That's all I'm interested in.
And on that beautiful bombshell, see you later, guys.
Okay.
All right.
Bye.
Bye.
Stay safe.
Take care.